I found this book review, 1987. Also from Executive Intelligence Review. And as you see, new attempt to cover up the English side of the Bolsheviks' trust. Well, the trust, exactly what was the trust? We'll get into that. It's by Alan Douglas and Scott Thompson. It's about Reilly, the First Man, a book by Robin Bruce Lockhart, 1987. I knew that the MI6 was involved in establishing the KGB, and different things sort of suggested to me that there's been an ongoing, very deep ties between the British and the Bolsheviks and the Russian government up till through the 90s. And in the little two-part thing I did on the real origins of Marxism, we delved into a lot of things that a lot of people are unaware of about the Bolsheviks, and the sense of urgency that I felt trying to get this information out there, even just to a very few people. This is a very exclusive YouTube channel. Things you'll find here, you won't be getting anywhere else. No, but it's all from EIR. And the more I delve into topics that I'm particularly fascinated by, the more I'm impressed with Executive Intelligence Review. What a fantastic resource it is for serious people. So get ready. This is pretty amazing. Wow, this is 1987. You could get a 176-page book for $3.95, paper-bound. Robin Bruce Lockhart, who catapulted British Secret Intelligence Service SIS agent Sidney Reilly into popular fame and televised glory as Reilly, Ace of Spies, the title of Lockhart's 1967 book, has just demolished that myth. I have to go put this on airplane mode. In his latest work, we learn that this supposedly daring, resourceful leader of anti-Bolshevik forces in the 1920s not only worked for Soviet spy agencies, but from 1925 into 1940s, personally set the stage for all the later infamous Soviet spies inside British SIS, Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, Kim Philby, Anthony Blunt, et al. These characters were gradually exposed from Burgess and Maclean's 1951 flight to Moscow up until most recent years as the third man, fifth man, and so on, of the Soviet network in SIS. Lockhart now proclaims that the great Reilly started the mess. He announced in his preface that, quote, "New evidence that I have unearthed has forced me to reconsider the whole question," unquote, of just whom Reilly was really working for. But Lockhart's revelations are a cover-up of the sort known in the trade as damage control. I'm sure we're all hip to that. Reilly, the first man, excuse me, appears at a time of intense warfare within British and American intelligence when Some of the highest levels in British intelligence have been charged as Soviet agents, a process closely related to debates in Britain and elsewhere on how to deal with the Soviet regime today. Certain British and American intelligence specialists, after re-examining the Sidney Reilly story, have concluded what U.S. Consul General DeWitt C. Poole, an American Secret Service chief, Xenophon Dmitrievich Kalamatiano, charged in 1918 that Reilly was working for the Bolsheviks all along, i.e., that he was not just turned after his disappearance into the USSR in 1925. For Lockhart, the son of one of Reilly's closest collaborators, to lift the veil from the 1918-1925 period would mean to really expose Reilly as a central figure in British and U.S. intelligence, banking, and industrial circles who helped sponsor the Russian Revolution of 1917 in the first place. In the 1920s, they continued that under the auspices of the organization known as the Trust. In many of their political and biological, where sexual proclivities permitted, heirs prolong their assistance to Soviet world domination. This gets good. My association with the Trust is that it was a kind of a false monarchist, pro-monarchy organization, kind of like parallel, or very similar to the Q movement. The PSYOP. But that's extremely superficial. I have a very, very superficial understanding going into this. So this is really interesting to me because it's provocative, of course. It's very interesting to consider that what was being done by the Bolsheviks in terms of kind of controlled opposition that was kind of vacuuming up dissidents or exposing them to Bolshevik persecution. That was my understanding. I could be very wrong. I have a feeling I am. But basically the idea was that this false monarchist organization provided people with kind of hopium, very similar to Q, and telling people basically, hey, don't worry about it. We've got people highly placed, high up in the military, and they're going to swoop down any moment, and they're going to get rid of the Bolsheviks, and they're going to reinstall the monarchy, basically. Lockhart's new material. In 1925, according to the previous myth, Sidney Reilly was lured into a trap conceived by Soviet Russia's first intelligence chief, Felix Dzerzhinsky. He went back to Russia, ostensibly to assess the strength of an alleged powerful internal opposition group with which SIS worked, the monarchist organization of Central Russia, known under its cover name in that heyday of the new economic policy as the Trust. Caught, the story goes, the master spy was liquidated. For decades afterward, rumors circulated about Reilly's fate. He might have survived, it was said. Some in MI5, British counter-espionage, strongly suspected that he had gone over to the Soviets, but nothing definite surfaced in public before the present book. Now, Robin Lockhart reports that Sidney Reilly's two closest associates in SIS circles, Captain George Hill and Robert Bruce Lockhart, father of the author, Both had proof, which they apparently kept from the relevant authorities, that Reilly not only survived, but went on to work for the OGPU, the Soviet intelligence organization. Maura Beckendorf, who had been Lockhart Sr.'s mistress in 1918, wrote to him in a 1932 letter that she had met Reilly in Russia, and George Hill, posted as British SIS liaison to the NKVD, successor to the OGPU, in Moscow during World War II, ran into his former agent Sergei Nekrasov, now an NKVD officer, who told him that Reilly was alive, working for the NKVD. This 1940s assignment for Hill was remarkable. Together with Reilly and Lockhart Sr., Hill had been a chief organizer of the Lockhart plot in 1918 to overthrow the Bolsheviks. Quote, to the astonishment of everyone, including Hill himself, Robin Lockhart reports, quote, from the short list of names put forward by the British, the NKVD expressed a firm preference for Hill as chief of the SOE mission. As for Lockhart Sr., he became deputy director of the Foreign Office and director of the Political Warfare Executive during World War II. All the while, Lockhart did not drop his old ties to Russia, in particular his friendship with Maura Beckendorf. She had gone on to become the mistress of Bolshevik culture leader Maxim Gorky, and then of pro-Soviet writer H.G. Wells. Although based in Britain from 1927 until shortly before her death in 1974, Beckendorf traveled freely in and out of Russia. Through Wells and my father, Maura met most of the people who, this is a quote, most of the people who mattered, and as a result was able to maintain her finger on the pulse of the political and diplomatic worlds. This, unquote, this was not of idle curiosity. Excuse me, I have this strange cough. I'm not sick, just, I don't know what it is, allergy, something. This was not out of idle curiosity. She was perhaps the Soviet Union's most effective agent of influence ever to appear on London's political and intellectual stage. The truth about the Lockhart plot, Lockhart now admits, nay, even emphasizes, that Reilly worked for the OGPU, an idea he vehemently poo-pooed when MI5 presented it to him in 1967. Why does Lockhart now just as vehemently deny that Reilly worked for the Bolsheviks back in 1918? In the hot, humid Moscow summer of 1918, Reilly and his closest SIS associates, Robert Bruce Lockhart and Captain George Hill, mounted a plot to overthrow the Bolshevik government. As World War I raged on the Western Front, the Eastern Front was silent. By the March of 1918 German-Soviet Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Russia had left the war. The Lockhart plot allegedly would overthrow the Bolsheviks and bring Russia back into the war. The Bolshevik leadership was badly split over Brest-Litovsk. The Holy War faction led by Dzerzhinsky and soon-to-be Red Commander Leon Trotsky argued for war against Germany at all costs. Lenin, fearing a continued war would end the revolution, threatened to quit the party unless the separate peace were signed. Lockhart had received instructions from London to, quote, exploit the differences between Lenin and the holy warriors, quote unquote. Hill described his work and the Lockhart plot's setting in his Go Spy the Land. Quote, I was instructed to keep in touch with them, the Bolsheviks, bearing in mind that they might come in on the Allied side. I therefore took an early opportunity of calling on Mr. Trotsky at the War Office. Trotsky knew all about the work I'd been doing and received me well. After our first talk, he appointed me, quote, Inspector of Aviation, and I was given extensive powers in that department. I was to give Trotsky advice on the formation of a new Air Force. 2 or 3 times a week, I would spend half an hour with him. I helped the Bolshevik military headquarters to organize an intelligence section. Secondly, I organized a Bolshevik counter-espionage section to spy on the German Secret Service and missions in Petrograd and Moscow. Savinkov's organization, the Socialist Revolutionary Terrorists, at the time of which I'm writing, had its own secret service. I was constantly in touch with this section. I was seeing Reilly daily, and he kept me informed of what he was doing and of his plans for a coup d'etat against the Bolsheviks. I was kept informed of all of this. If anything happened to Reilly, it would be possible for me to carry on the work. Reilly had no difficulty in traveling between Moscow and Petrograd, as he had obtained a position with the Cheka and had a Cheka pass. Thus, unquote, end quote. Thus, Reilly, allegedly plotting to overthrow the Bolsheviks, received a top job in the Bolshevik intelligence service, the Cheka, while his co-conspirator Hill organized what would become the counterintelligence branch of the Cheka, the KRO, and Red Army Intelligence, the GRU. The KRO, less than 3 years later, would create the infamous Trust. Lockhart, meanwhile, poured millions of rubles into the plot. The plot began in July with the assassination of the German ambassador, Count Mirbach. This hit was a signal for an uprising led by Boris Savinkov, the British-funded socialist revolutionary with whom Hill was constantly in touch. It was also meant to provoke a German declaration of war. Mirbach's assassin, Cheka officer Yakov Blyumkin, not only headed the counter-espionage unit founded by Hill, but was living next door to Lockhart in Hill and Lockhart's hotel. Savinkov's forces rose. Hill's friend Jakob Peters ran the Cheka investigation. Peters, who spent the previous decade in England and whose wife and child still lived there, found, quote, no evidence of foreign involvement. Reilly and company went ahead with the next phase to seize the Bolshevik leaders at an executive meeting and install a new government. The Petrograd Cheka head, Moisei Uritsky, had told the British that they were under his particular surveillance. On August 30th at 11:30 a.m., a socialist revolutionary assassinated Uritsky, and less than 12 hours later, another SR, Dora Kaplan, shot Lenin as he came out of a meeting. Kaplan's gun had been provided by Savinkov, Memoirs of a Terrorist. Reilly, in the following days, hid in the flat of Vera Petrovna, a close associate of Kaplan. When the smoke cleared, the Bolsheviks, far from being overthrown, were in fact vastly strengthened, especially Trotsky and Dzerzhinsky. On September 2nd, as Lenin lay in critical condition, Trotsky was named chairman of the newly created Revolutionary War Council, while Dzerzhinsky's Cheka gained vast new powers with the declaration of the Red Terror in response to the attacks on Uritsky and Lenin. The internal opposition, both monarchist and leftist, which had posed a substantial threat to the shaky Bolshevik regime, was smashed. While the dread Cheka could not manage to find Hill and Reilly, who were meeting daily in a public restaurant to plan their, quote, escape, they did manage to find and crush the American intelligence network led by Xenophon Calamatiano, who was sentenced to death. The failure of the Lockhart plot was ascribed by Reilly and company to a French communist journalist who infiltrated their group and gave the plot away. In his Secret Agent, Lockhart noted the upshot. I found that Poole, the American consul general, took a more serious view of the conspiracy. He was inclined to regard Reilly as an agent provocateur who had staged this plot for the benefit of the Bolsheviks. I laughed at Poole's fears. Ridiculous as this story was, I found, nevertheless, that through Poole it had gained some credence in England. When later I reached London, I had to go to bail with the Foreign Office for Reilly's bona fides. I did so without the slightest hesitation, unquote. In 1922, V.S. Kwiatkowski, head of the Anglo-Saxon desk of the KRO, the Cheka counterintelligence unit established by Hill, traveled to the Baltic states. Claiming to speak for an underground group inside Russia, he met British SIS personnel in the Baltic states to coordinate joint work. Virtually to a man, the chief personnel of this new opposition group, the Trust, were those whom Reilly, Lockhart, and Hill had worked in the summer of 1918. Sodomy and one-worldism. Why would a broad faction in British SIS work then and now on behalf of Soviet interests? Let me read that again. Why would a broad faction in British SIS work then and now on behalf of Soviet interests? How about the bankers and industrialists who supported the Bolshevik Revolution? Reilly's friends at his offices at 120 Broadway in New York City in the early 20s, were they all double agents or secret converts to communism? What these Western Trust partners share with the Soviets is a passionate hatred for the most basic values of Western Judeo-Christian civilization. Two most characteristic forms of this hatred recur repeatedly in the Western half of the Trust. Homosexuality is a cult, what the Cambridge Apostles called the higher sodomy, and the fanatical commitment by Western oligarchs and their servants to rid the world of republics to establish a one-world order. In a footnote, Robin Lockhart releases a crucial new fact in the Reilly case. The James Bond prototype, the great lover Sidney Reilly, was a bisexual. Reilly set up from the homosexual cult at Trinity College, Cambridge, known as the Apostles, the spy nest which produced Anthony Blunt, MacLean, Burgess, and many others. The Apostles argued that, quote, since women were mentally and physically inferior to men, homosexual love was of a higher order. According to Lockhart, Reilly's case officer on this gang of homosexual Soviet agents The home turn was one Semyon Nikolaevich Rostovsky, better known in intelligence circles as Ernst Henry. Henry, still active in 1986, authored a vicious attack on EIR's founder, Lyndon LaRouche, in Moscow's weekly New Times. So, okay. The second red dye of British intelligence is the one-worldist fanaticism of many of its chief personnel. The first British SIS chief, Mansfield Cumming, who deployed Hill and Reilly, was such a one-worldist. He was a close supporter of Kurt Hahn, the founder of the Gordonstone School associated with Lord Mountbatten, and the United World Colleges, founded to educate a one-worldist elite, which Mountbatten also championed and which are funded by Soviet agent Armand Hammer. The following expresses Reilly's own outlook in a letter he wrote to Robert Bruce Lockhart before his 1925 return to Russia on the subject of Bolshevism. Quote, "I believe that it is bound by a process of evolution to conquer the world, that is Bolshevism, as Christianity and the ideas of the French Revolution have done before it, and that nothing, least of all violent reactionary forces, can stem its ever-rising tide. The much decried and so little understood Soviets, which are the outward expression of Bolshevism as applied to practical government, are the nearest approach I know of to a real democracy based on true social justice, and that they may be destined to lead the world to the highest ideal of statesmanship, internationalism." From Captain George Hill in his 1936 dreaded hour, speaking of the League of Nations, in 1928, the League, in its machinery and functions, was as imperfect as the first aeroplane in comparison with the modern airliner. But its fundamental idea of substituting for a system of armed nationalism a system of disarmed internationalism and the renunciation of war by means of pooled security will live. In time, such a league will have sufficient strength and power to impartially police the world, and it will be accorded the same respect and authority that the police force of England enjoys today. From Arnold Toynbee, chief theoretician for the Round Table's Royal Institute of International Affairs, from the 1920s into the 60s, in his 1971 dialogue with Kei Wakaizumi of Kyoto Sangyo University. Quote, "If I am right in forecasting that a world government is likely to be the way in which we shall avoid liquidating ourselves in an atomic war, and if I live to see this development, I should, on the whole, be optimistic, because I should not expect the dictatorship to be permanent. It is most unlikely, I fear, that it will be established by the will or even with the acquiescence of the majority of mankind. It seems to me likely to be imposed on the majority by a ruthless, efficient, and fanatical minority inspired by some ideology or religion. I guess that mankind will acquiesce in a harsh, Leninian kind of dictatorship as a lesser evil than self-extermination or than a continuing anarchy which could end only in self-extermination. If the reluctant majority does accept this dictatorship on this ground, I think they will be making the right choice. Fascinating stuff. And as I read through it, I'm just more and more aware of all that I don't know. But I'm also drawing parallels with what's going on today. And I'm also thinking that the key players in the theater of today, where you have China, Russia, the United States, as entities, I know that there are more important motivating forces behind these entities known as nations, but these entities do have a dual nature. The United States certainly has a dual nature. China has a dual nature. People forget that. It's not monolithic. Russia has a dual nature, although it seems to me that, the side that favors progress and development is dominant, whereas in the United States it's recessive. It's almost stamped out. Any opposition to one-worldism is completely toothless. At least in any in officialdom. I don't mean that the people are toothless or that we're helpless. I don't mean that at all. And I think there are valiant souls at work, and I think that the struggle between those who favor spiritual, physical, intellectual sovereignty of the individual and the structures that they create cooperatively, and the sorts of projects that need to go forward in order to maximize the returns on human creativity. This faction, as opposed to the one-worldism that seeks to repress, control, and even deny those faculties of creative reason associated with big projects, innovation, freedom of expression. So this is the big drama. It's going on everywhere. And I think it's interesting to look into very few people are aware that there is one-worldism. There's a lot of anti-Russian rhetoric in the universities in Russia, and they're constantly having to purge these forces. Of course, Putin expelled the NGOs, which was a good move, and we know that these periodic opposition protests are fueled by the West. But just how deeply Western involvement, or specifically British intelligence, has its tentacles back, going into very deeply, historically, back into the deep structures of Russian society. That is something that, I'm opening a door to that. I'm trying to get into that. There's so much to research, and I think deep research is important. Knowing what the moving pieces were, and being able to identify the progenitors, and being able to spot signs of well, I mean, you know, there's the was the Club of Rome back in the 1970s that basically decreed or foreordained that this was going to happen, that the West was going to be demolished in a controlled demolition, and that fortunes would be shifted to the East, and that what looks to us like the end result of a long power struggle, and what looks to most people to be chaos, is in fact something that was planned a long time ago. So it's unfolding. And the chaos we see in Ukraine is certainly, it's hard to deny that there's a tremendous amount of chaos. And yet, this does go, I mean, it probably goes back, you know, you can hear rumblings of it from certain people back into the 60s, maybe probably earlier, I'm just not aware of it, that this, the bringing down of the American Republic, the destruction of the middle class and the industrial base, eventually the entire United States collapsing into a kind of pool, miasma, a kind of roiling degeneracy that you see, especially, you know, in the major cities. And that faith and hope and fortune would be identified as arising for the world, as hope for the world, which we see definitely Russia represents hope for African nations and Latin American nations. And in Mexico, the Mexican president, very supportive of Russia. So all I'm saying is it possible that what we're reading about here is being played out in our time? But I think the hope was back then. I think the hope was that under Bolshevism, which of course you see very strongly as a force, as a kind of solvent dissolving what was wholesome and productive about the American experience. They obviously anticipated that this would be the primary characteristic going forward with Russia. And there's hints that Russia has very clearly shifted to its other nature. As I said, you know, Russia, China, the United States have these dual nature, I believe. And that Russia has successfully managed to finally sort of consolidate itself around the productive, pro-human identity, and that this is what's happened, and that the globalists are really screwed by this, or are their dreams finally coming to fruition, and those of us who believe that the world is bound for sort of a global renaissance are deluded or will be sorely disappointed. I don't like to believe that. There's a lot of things we don't like to believe. A lot of things that we prefer not to think about. But we'll continue to get into it. And